Welcome. Thank you for joining us for our program, Native Plant Basics, a conversation with Reed Pugh. My name is Helen Liu, and I'm the Programming and Partnerships Manager at Cary Library. Before we begin, I'd like to thank the Cary Library Foundation and Lexington Living Landscapes for co-sponsoring this event. This program is being recorded and will be posted to the library's YouTube channel. If you have any questions, please enter them into the Q&A or chat. Now I'd like to pass the mic to Charlie Weinman, who'd like to say a few words about Lexington Living Landscapes and introduce our guests tonight.
Great, thank you, Helen. Good evening and welcome. We're delighted to have you with us. I'm Charlie Weinman with Lexington Living Landscapes. And before I turn the floor over to Reed and Andy, let me say a few words about us, for any of you not familiar with us. We're a local volunteer nonprofit initiative launched in 2020 to promote more sustainable landscaping practices in town. More native plants, fewer invasives, fewer chemicals, more trees. We grew out of a partnership or collaboration between a town committee, the Sustainable Lexington Committee, and three nonprofits, the Lexington Field and Garden Club, Lexington Climate Action Network, and Citizens for Lexington Conservation. You can learn more about us, including how to sign up for our newsletter, at our website, www.lexingtonlivinglandscapes.org. Among our many activities is our annual native plant sale, done in collaboration with the town, scheduled for this coming Saturday from 9 to 11 in the morning at the DPW facility at 201 Bedford Street. Go to our website to learn how to pre-order or stop by Saturday morning to see what's available. Bring cash or checks, please, no credit cards. Our great thanks to Reed for joining us this evening and sharing his wisdom with us. And thanks as always to Helen and our friends at Cary Library for hosting this evening's program. We're going to try a slightly different format than our usual presentations, with this evening's program conducted as an interview of Reed by Andy Joint of our steering team. After a series of questions Andy has prepared, we will open it up to the audience, with Andy asking your questions. So please put them in the Q&A. We would prefer that rather than the chat, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. Now let me introduce our guest and get out of the way. For over 25 years in San Francisco and Boston, Reed Pugh has worked in multiple nurseries, had his own design, installation, and maintenance businesses on both coasts, managed a 30-acre historic private estate in Brookline, and managed one of the top fine gardening companies in New England. Most recently, he focuses his passion on working individually with people in their gardens and showing them how to make their gardens and landscapes beautiful through inspiration, knowledge, and proper care with his company, Barking Dog Gardens. Reed, thank you for joining us this evening. Reed and Andy, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Charlie. And thanks to the Cary Library for hosting tonight, and welcome, Reed. Reed, I've been a fan of your newsletter, The Barker, since I gained an interest in gardening myself. And I really appreciate this kind of hyper-local focus of your newsletter for our Metro West area, right here around Boston.
Hopefully this is less an interview, as Charlie mentioned, and more of a conversation.
Yeah, right, absolutely. And it's a pleasure for me to pick your brain a little bit. I still consider myself a newbie in the gardening world. I've slowly, through the Lexington Living Landscapes plant sale and some other local nurseries that I know you'll mention this evening, I've been adding native plants to my garden, but still could use some tips. So I'm looking forward to gaining some knowledge from you this evening. And I'd like to start really with the basics, just from a fundamental standpoint. Maybe you can sort of introduce the idea of native plant gardening. What is the definition of native plant gardening, and why is it becoming increasingly important?
Well, I think it depends who you're talking to. There are some people who have a very rigid view of what native plant gardening is. I think anyone who's planting a native plant is a native plant gardener. Anyone who's expressing interest, anyone who's here tonight wanting to learn more. Andy, as you said, you're a newbie. You need to acquire the knowledge. You need to put some plants in the ground and see how they go. I think anyone doing that is a native plant, gardener. But I think it's important to understand why we need to do this. And that is for years of agriculture and clearing spaces and removing habitat, building, developments, we've gotten rid of the native plants that insects, birds, mammals um, have all relied upon. And so we need to start replacing that and providing spaces for them to come to. Um, and so we need to provide all the things the ecosystem needs with plants, which is nectar, which is what feeds them, pollen, which is used for pollinating and creating new plants, but is also a food for many insects, and providing these host plants. And this is something that a lot of people don't know about, but certain plants are host plants for many of our native animals, insects, birds, whatever. And what that means is they need that plant to survive. They lay their eggs there, they live in it, they eat the leaves and the foliage. As much as many of us as gardeners hate that when someone's eating our roses, this is what happens in the native world. Native plants serve a critical purpose in this cycle. And if we remove it, as we've done in so many areas, then populations plummet. I'm not going to go into great detail, but Doug Tallamy, which Charlie mentioned, if anyone really wants to learn, Doug Tallamy, I think, is one of the greatest resources we have in providing accessible information. But he talks about the plummeting populations of birds and mammals and insects. Robert Jagir out of UMass Dartmouth talks about endangered bees because we don't have this habitat. So this is why it's important. These resources I just mentioned, they're going to be included in a leave behind that will get sent out. But I think anyone who's willing to learn and start this process is part of this, part of this relatively new movement. So.
And so that ecological value certainly is a key benefit of the native plant gardening movement. What would you say are some other benefits that come out of transitioning our landscapes to a more native state?
Native plants are beautiful. And if, I'm sure at some point we'll talk about designing with plants, but there are many native plants that are beautiful, that flower and provide interest throughout the year. I mean, I think about Amelanchier, a tree that just finished flowering. It flowers beautiful white flowers in the spring and gets red berries in the summer and beautiful, stunning color in the fall. It outdoes many non-native ornamental trees that people put in. So they're beautiful. But the other thing is a lot of people find that gardens require a lot of care, traditional gardens, non-native gardens. And they're using herbicides and insecticides and pinching this and deadheading that. Native gardens don't really require that once plants are established. Now, that doesn't mean if you have a 2,000 square foot garden on an 8,000 square foot lot, like I do in Winchester, and many people do, you don't have 20 acres out somewhere. You can do a little nipping and tucking, you can do a little work to keep things clean, but they really don't require as much care. In fact, that's a critical part of using native plants. If we start cutting off and deadheading and removing seeds, then they don't provide the ecological value. But I think the other thing, and Doug Tallamy talks about this a lot, is just put some plants in and see what happens. See who comes to your garden. I mean, not only can you have beautiful flowers, but you can have butterflies and moths and skippers, hundreds of different types of bees, all the other insects, birds come back. And so you get a different part of life that comes to your garden. I was joking actually before we started this conversation with Charlie and Andy about, some people come to me and they want plants that don't attract bees. Well, that's a critical part of what native plant gardening is to attract all of these insects that need these plants to survive.
Yeah, it's interesting. And so when you're giving a presentation like this to someone like me, I'm kind of part of the choir already, and maybe a lot of our audience members are. But from my standpoint, I look at my neighbors to the left, to the right, and I'm not seeing that transition into native gardening. And it makes me think that there's probably still some misconceptions that people have. And so I'm wondering if you can point out some of those misconceptions that you've observed in your work, and maybe give us some ammo when we're talking to our neighbors of how we can kind of dispel some of those misconceptions.
I mentioned in the beginning that there are different types of people who are in this community trying to encourage people to plant native. I have a very easygoing perspective. If people are willing to put their toe in the water and they see the benefit, they're going to add more at a later point. I had never shamed people. There are plenty of people out there saying if you're not growing native plants, you're killing the environment. I never say that. I try and encourage people. But some of the misconceptions is, and all you have to do is go down to your local river or stream and see that, native plants, the perception is they're ugly and out of control, that they're just these wild messes of things growing together. And sure, if you left your garden, your traditional non-native garden alone for 20 years, it would be a hot mess too. So you kind of have to give a break for what happens in the natural world. But it's a misnomer that they're ugly and out of control. You can let them go that way. If you have 20 acres, you can let a completely native garden and with shrubs and trees and perennials go, or you can keep it a little bit more neat. And it's relatively easy to do with a little work in your own garden. You know, this has been coming up a lot in the drought recently. The droughts, the 3 of the 4 last years. Native plants don't need water. Every plant, no matter what it is, needs water established, but also a native plant doesn't mean it doesn't need water. You have to look at native plants and their environment. A cardinal flower, lives in a wetland area. It needs constant water. You can't plant cardinal flowers with butterfly weeds that require dry and sun. So you need to know your plant, and you need to know, but after they're established, if they're positioned in the right place, if a wetland plant is in a wetter area and a upland plant that requires dry and sunny area, if they're sited properly, then they don't require care. So a lot of people also think that native plants aren't colorful. They don't flower for very long. They don't really provide much interest. And that's just because you haven't been exposed to, many of the native plants that do. I just mentioned Amelanchier. I challenge you to find a finer flowering ornamental tree. I mean, there are some, but I mean, it's up there, and it's a stunning native that provides for birds and insects. So they do provide interest for the garden. And in fact, native plants oftentimes provide more interest to the garden into the fall and winter. If we manage them the way we're supposed to, which is leave things up, leave seed heads up, it brings in birds and a lot more interest. I guess probably the number of nurseries that have opened recently, and native only nurseries just in Massachusetts, and really the New England area. Used to be there was hard to find native plants. There were only small places, or you had to go commercial, or you had to go to New England wetland plants, or whatever it was, and you couldn't buy them as a homeowner. Well, garden sales like this are happening all the time. Garden trading that's happening in people's garden, and we have a Winchester gardening page, and people are always trading plants there. And there's so many native only nurseries that are around that you can really go deep in finding plants. The bigger nurseries are coming around, but I think a lot of people thought that, it's too hard to go find them. But I find that when people really get the bug and they want to learn about native plants and get into it, they have no problem driving to Norwell to Blue Stem, or driving down to Prickly Ed's in Barrington, or Butterfly Effect in Westport, or going up north to New Hampshire. It's an expedition to go and find the things that they want. So I think a lot of these are old misconceptions, but I think a lot of them have been put to bed, put to rest.
Well, you've convinced me that it's a good idea to go out and try some of these native plants, and hopefully our audience is feeling the same way. And maybe some of our audience has taken part in the native plant sale, or maybe they'll visit some of the nurseries that
Well, I hope they're not here by mistake tonight. So
right, exactly.
This is all going to be native plants. If you're waiting for something else, we're not going to be talking about anything else.
Yeah. So maybe let's get into some of the more detailed work of when you get these plants home and you're staring at them, and now the next step is, okay, I've got to put these things in the ground, and then I've got to care for them or make sure they get off on the right foot. So let's dive a little bit into the caring and providing for these plants. So what on the most fundamental level, what are some of the steps that you would recommend folks take when they're starting off a new native plant garden?
Well, actually, I mean, you said, when you bring all these plants home, I'd start before you went out to go and buy the plants. Um, you need to get a really honest assessment of what's going in your garden. Think about native plants, and I'll probably refer to this a bunch during tonight, but native plants are native to the area. They like our native soil. They like our native climate. They thrive in this area. So the first thing I would do is a soil test. Now, if you live on a farm, if you got 20 acres and it's all pretty much undisturbed, then I wouldn't do that. But the challenge is many of our gardens, many of our properties have been amended over the years and will have very high nutrient levels, will have very high organic matter levels. And this is not what a native plant likes. So often, many of the native plants don't thrive or die because um, the soil is not right. So do a soil test. I put a link. There's a link I think in the leave behind, or the thing that's going to be sent out to the UMass Soil Lab. Um, Also, and this is a common thing, people say, "Oh, I've got a sunny garden, lots of sun, but it's 2 hours of sun in the midday." You need to be very honest about what sun your garden gets throughout the year, not just in June, July, and August, but in April and May, and September and October. Um, you need to do a real assessment to see how much sun you have, because if you want to buy some sun plants, if you want to put butterfly weed or agastache in your garden, you need to have a lot of sun. And full sun is 6+ hours of sun. So you need to understand the sun and the soil. And I mentioned just before, you need to understand the nature of your plants. I think I know, like, for example, the sun list of plants in the plant sale, you have harebell, butterfly weed, cardinal flower, and mountain mint. 4 great plants. Um, Harebell and butterfly weed like sunny and dry. Cardinal flower and mountain mint like it's sunny and wet. You can't plant cardinal flower next to butterfly weed and expect them both to survive. You're either going to overwater or you put the butterfly weed in too wet of an area. So even though the selection is a great selection of plants, you can't plant all of those plants in the same space. You're going to need to plant, the cardinal flower and mountain mint in an area that's going to get a little bit more moisture. This is no different than regular traditional gardening. We all, and we've all made mistakes. I do too. I have a plant I want so much in my garden, and I don't have the space, and I put it in a questionable area, and it doesn't thrive. So if you think about this, if your soil is off, and your sun is off, and your water is off, your plant's going to die. I've written in my newsletter about what I call the plant trilogy, which is soil, light, and water. You need to get 3 of those right for a plant to thrive. So you need to have it in the proper soil, the proper light, and the proper water. 2, if you meet 2 of those 3, it'll survive. It'll do okay. 1, it won't, so you really need to pay attention with native plants as to where they come from. And you can go to sites like Native Plant Trust. They've got a great plant finder, and it tells you where they come from and the conditions that they like. And you just have to match those in your garden. It's like putting the rhododendron in a full sun dry site. It's going to die. It's the same here. If you put cardinal flower in a dry area, full sun, half sun, it's just not going to do well. It needs extensive moisture. So those are some of the basics, I guess.
And I'll just mention to our audience, Reed is bringing up some really valuable resources, and we'll follow up this program tonight with an email to everyone who registered for the program with some links to some of the resources that Reed is mentioning. So if anyone's furiously trying to jot down and Google things, there will be resources provided after. We're talking about, you're getting new plants and putting them in the ground for the first time, picking and choosing the right site based on soil, light conditions. Is there any difference that you would mention in the care of these plants once they are established, once they've got a few seasons in your garden?
Yeah, and I'll say something. I teach a number of different classes, and I do a series on pruning throughout the year. And what I say in that class, I'll say again now. The most important thing, if you forget everything, if you lose the link, if you don't get the leave behind, know your plant. You have to know your plant, certainly before you prune it, but before you plant it. Just sort of like I was talking about before, understanding the difference between the 4 sun plants in the kit that you can buy, knowing the difference between butterfly and cardinal flower. You need to know your plant, and it has to be genus and species. And I'm sorry, I'll explain that. If everyone understands genus and species, Asclepias tuberosa is butterfly weed. Asclepias is the genus, tuberosa is the species. Under the genus of Asclepias, there are a number of different species. So we have butterfly weed and swamp milkweed are 2 examples of Asclepias. They couldn't be more different. You can't grow them together. You're saying, oh, well, it's a milkweed. Don't the butterflies love the milkweed? Don't the monarchs love the milkweed? They do, but you need to know your plant. Even within the genus, just because it's an Asclepias, you think, oh, it's a sunny, loving plant. But you need to know the conditions that they like and what they're going to thrive in. So, I would also say, and many gardeners will like it, because honestly, one of the questions I get a lot of times when people want to start working in their garden is, I would like a low maintenance garden. Well, once you get plants established, a native plant garden is generally lower maintenance. And it depends how you want to keep it. If you want to let it go, let it go. If you want to have it look like a somewhat more manicured garden, I probably shouldn't have used the word manicured, but let's say a somewhat tidier garden, they require a little bit of work. But once they're established, once you've watered them so that the roots are deeply established, and if they're in the right location, they should not require any supplemental water. Okay, here comes the asterisk. Except for the last 4 years.
Right. Yeah.
You didn't have to be out watering your native plant garden every week like you probably were with your rhodies and macrophylla hydrangeas. But during droughts, I would have recommended a couple times during the year to hit your native plant garden with some water, because while they are native to the area, native doesn't mean they can endure 4-month droughts. So native does not mean set it and forget it. But it does far more than a more traditional garden. Andy, we were talking the other day when we were talking about this, and you didn't realize that native plant gardens can actually be, sort of kept and cleaned up. The whole purpose of growing native plants is to support the ecosystem. And the ecosystem, as I mentioned earlier, is with nectar to feed and pollen to feed and be taken home by bees, and to provide hosting, for other insects and animals. But so if we start pruning and deadheading and taking off flowers and taking off seed heads, then they're not servicing the ecosystem. But if you have a smaller garden and you want to grow cranberry viburnum or silky dogwood, you've got a wet spot, these are monsters. They want to be monsters, but it doesn't mean that you can't cut a few of the taller stems out on occasion to keep them a little bit more contained. So instead of being 15-foot plants, they could be 8-foot plants. So they can be managed in your garden as long as you understand and you know your plant. So you're not pruning out the flowers so they don't flower and seed for a whole season. So they can be, managed and kept in gardens. And also to that point with letting plants go to seed, a lot of native plants are not long-lived. So we need them to go through the cycle. So a cardinal flower and a bee balm are relatively short-lived plants. But if we tried to treat them like a traditional plant and deadhead them and contain them, then they would disappear from your garden in a couple of years. Cardinal flower, because it's one of the flowers that's in the sale.
Yeah.
They typically only live a couple of years. They're prolific seeders, and so if we were to deadhead them, then they wouldn't have the seed to create the new plants that take 2 years to start flowering again. So it's kind of a cycle. And the funny thing is when we plant our traditional gardens, they kind of stay put. You put a plant there, it's going to be there in 10 years. Native gardens evolve and move, and it depends whether you have plants that are really aggressive and are self-seeding and moving around. bee balms, for example, they send out root growth, so they'll spread and shift. The original plant will die in a number of years, but the new plant will be over here. They sort of shift and evolve. So I'm kind of rambling on. I think I kind of got to this question.
No, but I think there's a lot of beauty in that evolution of your garden. It's much more appealing to me than a garden that is set it and forget it, and it's just going to look exactly the same year after year. I don't know. That sounds a little boring to me.
Well, and that's the experimentation of native plants. If you have, if you really wanted that plant and you put it in knowing that the soil wasn't right or the light wasn't right, it's not going to live, and maybe another plant will fill that space. Or you can collect seeds from the plant and put them in that space, and they'll grow in the next year. The beauty of native plants is that once everyone starts, buying these kits and putting plants in the ground, is we're going to have seeds for, forever. And this is the nature of what we're trying to accomplish.
Yeah.
I do a plant giveaway to my clients every year, and it used to be cuttings of plants that I grew in pots and seeds I would buy. Now all the seeds that I grow, the seedlings I give out, are native plants because they're so prevalent, so easy to grow.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll just add a little bit of my own personal experience with getting seedlings from some of these nurseries and native plant sales, which is, and maybe this is a me problem, but I have experienced putting these plants in the ground for the first time and then thinking, oh, this isn't working. This plant is struggling, and it didn't make it. It died. I had this experience with some scarlet bee balm and a shrubby St. John's wort that I just thought, oh, these are gone. It didn't work. But gardening is an exercise in patience, and not for those who don't have a lot of patience, because lo and behold, next season comes around and those plants were just taking their time and getting established, and now are growing quite well, right in those very same spots. So to a certain extent, we also have to give some time and let these plants establish themselves, before we make any snap judgments on what's
It's no
successful.
different than a traditional garden.
Yeah.
Unless you can afford to go out and buy the 40-foot tree and the 6-foot shrubs, everyone requires a load of patience. And we all experienced a brutal year, a brutal winter, and if you transplanted plants or did some planting in the fall, it was a very tough spring. So you need a little bit of luck. Sometimes it's not always the gardener. I've got clients who say they have black thumbs. It's not always the gardener. Sometimes it's the conditions. And as I mentioned before, native plants, they're used to what our native environment is and conditions, but we have aberrant winters and, climate changes. So
we've touched on a little of the content on kind of pitfalls that people run into, or common mistakes that people run into with their native plants. Anything else you wanted to flag there?
Well, you can save a lot of money with them. You don't need to buy herbicides and insecticides. You don't need to fertilize native plants. In fact, you do not want to fertilize native plants, provided they are in the right location and the proper soil. Fertilization is the worst thing you can do. Over pampering them. There's a plant that we call redbud, and the nickname in the trade is deadbud, because oftentimes they end up in special gardens with special soil amendments, and they just don't survive. And we talked about improper siting and soil conditions, poor pruning. I've been talking to some other people, the idea about creating a certification program for contractors to understand how to best care for gardens, period, whether they're native or non-native. And one of them really has to be around how we manage cleanups and fall cleanups. We need to avoid the thing that contractors, and I will say out of ignorance, cut everything down and take away every bit of organic matter in the fall from your gardens. We need to get away from this, learning to leave things alone. But that's It's a whole other topic, but
It is, but I think we should explore it a little bit. The concept of fall cleanup. I mean, we're sitting here in May. It's prime time, right? Everything's either blooming or coming into bloom right now. So we're focused on the spring season, but of course we've got 4 full seasons here in Massachusetts. So I'm curious, what would you flag for people who are who want to keep in mind the considerations that you should have outside of this kind of primary growing season? What should we be thinking about in the other seasons in terms of care?
um, sort of like we were talking about earlier. I mean, cleanup.
Yeah.
These are native plants, so mimic nature. Allow them to do what they're doing. If you think about a woodland garden, well, what does a woodland look like? It's covered in leaves that fall from trees, from deciduous trees in the fall. That is our natural mulch. We need to learn to start leaving things alone. Again, I go back to, I did say there are things you can do to keep your garden a little bit cleaner. That doesn't mean that, um, we want to go into sort of the older practice, but leave things alone. Don't cut back in the fall. Um, a trick that I've learned is, we talked about some of these aggressive plants. It's okay if you have an aggressive plant in a garden and you want to protect one that maybe isn't doing so well or getting bullied by this other one. You can cut some of the seed heads off in the fall. Cut the seed heads off, take them in and grow them for the spring. So the things you can do. But and everyone, if you're here tonight, you've probably heard of the Leave the Leaves movement. And there really could be nothing more important. I write every year sometime in my newsletter about how organic matter in the soil in the gardens is a zero-sum game. Why do we continue to take multiple layers of blowers through our gardens and take every inch of organic matter out of our lawns? Yes, lawns are okay to have, just say that there. Every bit of matter out of our garden beds. It makes no sense, because then we have to come and add it back in. If you have a deciduous tree on in your yard, you have all the material to mulch for the spring. You can shred them. You can shred them early. You can get really pretty decent shredders, from box stores. Do it early, because to shred your leaves and put them back in as a mulch, and it'll be there in the spring. You don't have to do anything. You don't want to be doing that in November and December when the insects are starting to burrow into the leaves and burrow into the ground. But the first flush of leaves in October, you can shred them and put them back in your gardens, and you'll never have to touch them again. That's the food. That's the fertilizer for plants. And then when we're cutting back, and something that we've been doing in more recent years that's really important is understanding. We talked about servicing all the different insects and animals. Well, for habitat, many of the insects and bees like to live in stems. So if you think about nature, if you didn't cut back perennials that are growing in a wetland area, the stems will break off in the winter or break down, and they leave 2-foot stems. A lot of insects nest in those in subsequent years. So when we're doing cleanups, we don't want to go back into the traditional thing, which is cut everything to the ground, show the bare soil, but we want to leave stems for nesting. The new plants are going to cover those stems up in no time. And then don't take those stems away. If you're going to go in the spring and cut back your perennial garden or your native garden, just cut everything and leave it where it is. It's all organic matter. It's all an important part of the process. So I'm hoping that some people are saying, hey, a lot of what you're talking about requires less work.
We were just transitioning to our next topic. I think we caught all of what you said as we were talking about the value of having insects in the fall and making sure that we're establishing the right conditions for them to overwinter. And I think it's a perfect transition point into the next topic that I wanted to cover or return to from earlier, which is the kind of why of native plant gardening, which is enhancing the ecological value of our landscape, in addition to the aesthetic value of these plants as well. So do you want to comment on how we can approach designing our gardens to maximize the ecological value and create thriving ecosystems?
It really comes down to one word, which is diversity. Now, I'll mention something I just kind of popped into my head. There's a great movie called, or sort of a documentary called The Biggest Little Farm. It's not native, but what it does is it teaches many of the principles that are so important, um, that are paid off here. And they created this farm out in Los Angeles, just north of Los Angeles, in dead land. And it took them a number of years, and they went through a number of challenges, but it was the diversity that brought everything back. And so they had populations of snails and populations of birds that overwhelmed them. But if they let nature take its course, in came the owls to eat the, to scare or to eat the groundhogs, and the uh, the thing is, nature figured a way to solve out the imbalance in the system.
Yep.
And the imbalance in the system is our lack of diversity. So adding um, milkweed for monarchs is great, but if all you do is add milkweed in your garden and you add 50 milkweed plants, then what happens to the monarchs before they get there? What happens to the insects? The other insects. You need to add diversity to take care of everyone as best you can. You also need to look at providing color, because when you say color, color means flower, and flower means nectar and pollen. You need to provide that throughout the season. Imagine if your supermarket, you could only walk, you didn't have a car, and your supermarket shut down July, August, and September, and you had no food. That's what happens when you don't have the diversity, when you only have bee balm and milkweed, but you don't have plants that take you into the fall, like the goldenrods and the asters, that give birds and butterflies the energy to fly south. So you need to provide that diversity. I talked about nectar, pollen, hosting. If you read a book, like I mentioned with Doug Tallamy, we can't cover this all here, but those are three of the key things. Nectar is the immediate food that everyone's looking for. Pollen is part of the pollination process, but important for bees as food. And hosting, host plants get consumed oftentimes by many insects and animals. So those are the things we need to kind of look at broadly.
And I think that improves one's enjoyment of their own garden. Once you start realizing it's not just about enjoying the plants that you have there, but the diversity of wildlife that you have as well. I came into gardening kind of through bird watching, which is a passion of mine. And once you learn the bird species, that's one thing, but then you start figuring out, oh, these certain species like these certain trees, because those trees host these insects that they eat. And once you start to make all those connections, they really can be quite rewarding and enjoyable, in addition to kind of the restoration effort that we can do on our own and bring.
Yeah, and most of us on our 10 or 15,000 square foot lots can't have willows and oaks and then all of the understory shrubs and all of the perennials. You have to kind of look in the broader environment, but do the best that you can.
Yeah. So to that end, do you have any specific recommendations of plant combinations that you think work particularly well in supporting local wildlife?
What's funny, when we talk about traditional design, you sit down and you talk to a client and they say, well, I would like a cool garden. And you say, okay, so purples and pinks and whites. And you want a long season, or wouldn't mind a hotter garden over here in the summertime. So we're oftentimes thinking about color and texture and other things. But when it comes to native plants, you have to start thinking, sort of as I was saying before, how they're servicing the ecosystem. So, to your point, we need to make sure that we are providing a season's breadth of nectar and pollen, and plants that are available for them. Birds need seeds. Birds feed caterpillars to their babies. So you need to have all of these different things. The seeds fall and feed the mammals. The berries and the nuts in the winter feed mammals and other animals and the birds. So you need to think about it not in terms of color, while we can, I've got some really interesting pictures to show, but we can have beautiful colors in the garden. We tend to think of it a little bit differently in terms of making sure that I have spring ephemerals that are providing early pollen or early pollen and nectar in April and May. Sorry, ephemerals are plants that tend to come up in woodland areas under deciduous trees, and they flower very early in the year before the canopy, before the leaves have opened up, and like they have in Winchester and Lexington. We need those early plants before anything else is flowering to provide that energy for early bees. As you've seen, if you've been out in your garden for the last couple of weeks, plenty of bees, plenty of insects humming around. They need plants to feed them. And then you have to go into the season and make sure that you have all of those things, throughout the year. If you live on 20 acres, we could do it all, but most of us don't. And so we have to find a way in our own way to service as best we can, but also make sure that there is food available in the garden, throughout the year. You've got some great plants on the in the plant sale, some great ground covers: partridge berry, wild strawberry, Pennsylvania sedge. I've got a great picture of Pennsylvania sedge, but these are great ground cover plants that provide important cover and food throughout the year. An important part. Pennsylvania sedge and partridge berry and wild strawberry may not be the sexiest plants. It's not going to be like an agastache or a butterfly weed that's going to blow your doors off, or a sneeze weed. There's another one that you guys have on the list. Sneeze weed is one of my favorite, and it doesn't cause an allergenic response. It's called sneeze weed because they used to use it in snuff, which is something back a few century or so ago people used to inhale. But it's not allergenic. Some of those are sexier plants. Some of these aren't, but they provide great cover, great ground covers. So when you think about vinca, everyone plants vinca in their garden, and it's become an invasive plant. Replant with Pennsylvania sedge or wild strawberry or partridge berry. You think about the true, if you go to Native Plant Trust and go to their plant finder, they've got a great resource there where you can learn about any and every plant that's native, basically, in the various ecoregions. Won't get into that, but basically different regions around New England, the plants are native. Oak, willow, pine are some of our biggest and important pollinator plants. Blueberry, elderberry are great plants that many of us know about and grow in our gardens that provide, they have flowers, they provide fruit and nuts. Aster, goldenrod and mountain mint are on your list. Milkweed, one of the milkweeds, is on your list. These are powerful plants that produce well above their weight in terms of the needs that they provide in the garden.
Yeah,
As well as those spring ephemerals that I was mentioning, whether it's trout lily or trilliums or bluebells, or there are just so many of them that are delicate little plants, and a lot of people don't like them because they disappear. But instead of growing bulbs, grow some spring ephemerals in your garden, and they're a lot of fun.
You just threw out a whole list of great plants, and I feel like it's probably got our audience at this point raring to go out and pick up some plants and get going. And like you said, of course, we have our native plant sale, but I also want to make sure that we mention where else we can source quality native plants locally, because that's an important piece too. Not just the species, but are we getting it from a particular nursery that is focused on the native plant movement? So what should we look for when we're purchasing plants? I mean, would you point us to any particular areas?
Well, Grow Native has a great list of nurseries around the region. That's a great place to start. I would encourage you, if you're willing to travel a little farther, to support the smaller nurseries. I think it's so important that we support these smaller businesses that are doing it right. And when I say that, there are a lot of not so reputable growers who actually go out in the wild and decimate populations of wild native plants to get the seeds that they then grow from. Good, reputable, smaller nurseries either do it from their own seed that they have on site, or they collect wild, and they have very specific protocols for how they collect without actually breaking down the ecosystem that they're pulling things from. So I'd really recommend that you go explore and pay attention to some of these smaller I think you get yours from Bagley Pond up in New Hampshire. I think I mentioned butterfly effect in Westport. Go down to the beach for the day and go see a butterfly effect. Prickly Ed, and it is a Prickly Ed who runs the place. Blue Stem and Norwell. Go out to Garden of the Woods. Native Plant Trust, which is what used to be the New England Wildflower Garden. They changed their name a decade ago to Native Plant Trust, and that's where their focus is. They have Garden in the Woods, which is their main garden. It's a 30-some acre garden, stunning. If you want to actually see native plants done right, that's where you should go and just spend time at different times of the year. They also have a nursery there. You can buy native plants, or you can go out to their farm, the Sami farm out in somewhere out west. I can't remember where it is. So you can buy native plants from reputable places, knowing that the money you spend is going to go back into the right places. That would be my suggestion.
Yeah.
Now, the bigger nurseries, I'll just, the Mahoney's, the Westons, the local nurseries around us, are slowly catching on. They do have native plants. I know, Weston took over Stonegate Gardens out in Lincoln, where I worked 25 years ago when I came back from the West Coast. But they don't carve out a separate area yet, or they didn't last year for natives, so they're all mixed in. I know Russell's out in Wayland carves out a separate native section. I was talking to John Gadradis, who runs Van Berken, which is a wholesale nursery up in New Hampshire, my favorite place, and considered probably the best perennial grower in New England. And they do both native and non-native, but they have really great native plants. He said, in talking with some of these bigger nurseries, that they're getting turned off by the native movement, because some of the stronger-willed native people come into these nurseries and they attack their associates for not having enough native plants, for not doing it right, not carving out, why don't you have a section? And so it's actually turning off a lot of the big nurseries. And I think it's a shame, because no matter what it is you're trying to convince people to do, whether it's to buy something different or not eat meat or vote some way, shaming people into doing things never works. You need to encourage them. And I think it's silly that people are going into those bigger nurseries, because we need all of them. We need all of the nurseries to carve out a section for native plants.
Right. There's a term that I've heard, but I'm not that familiar with it, called local ecotype. And so I'm curious, we're talking about native plants, getting them from local nurseries. So what is local ecotype, and how does that kind of factor into the picture here?
So many native plants, be it butterfly weed or cardinal flower, are native to large swaths of the country.
Right.
So you can buy that plant, and you'll find it in the wild, some in many areas. But like humans, I don't want to go into stereotypes, but like humans, there are different aspects of people, whether you live in Wisconsin or whether you live down south or whether you live in New England. And it's the same. Local ecotype basically means that the seeds and the plants are grown from plants that are genetically accustomed to whatever the local area is. And I'll use Van Berken as an example, the nursery I just mentioned. They're creating a local ecotype program. They just bought a new farm, and they're going to create what they're calling a New England local ecotype. And they are going to collect seed from across New England of the genus and species of plant that they want to grow. And then they are going to bring a minimum of 3 different populations of seed together. And it's going to have a genetic marker that's going to make them more used to the climate, more used to the soil, more used to the environment in New England. And so it's a genetic thing. A lot of us go to, and have in the past, and still do, go to a place called Prairie Moon out in Minnesota. Earned Seeds is out in the Midwest. And you can buy plants and seeds from out there, and they're getting into regional ecotypes too. But you're buying a plant that might be used to the plains. It might not be used to the cold, even though it's the same genus and species. I mean, it's like putting someone from Georgia and putting them up into Minnesota. They're not going to like the wintertime. They're going to survive, just like the plants would survive if they're not local ecotype. So local ecotype is taking native to another level, basically where they're saying the genetic diversity is, or the genetics are attuned to local environment and conditions. Um, and so it makes them stronger, it makes them more able to adapt in your garden. And you're going to start to see it, or you should see it, if you go to a native plant nursery. They're going to talk about it. You might see it on labels. Van Berkom puts it on the labels of their plants, and most any nursery you go to is going to have Van Berkom plants. And you're going to see the local ecotype versus the non-local ecotype. Doesn't mean that a plant that's not labeled local ecotype, say that 3 times in a row, isn't going to survive. It will. But one that's LE, it probably has a better chance of assimilating quickly and establishing well.
Mhm. Okay, that's great. That's a good thing to look out for as we're shopping around. I know we've talked about a lot of the resources that are out there and available, and like I mentioned before, we'll follow up with some particular links that Reed wants to point our audience to. But any others that you would mention if we're particularly focused on LE, on local ecotype plants?
Native Plant Trust. Everyone, they are in the business of educating people about the world of native plants. As I said, they have a nursery. They have a garden in the woods as a stunning garden at every time of the year. They just finished up their Trillium Week. They've got an amazing display of trilliums in the spring, a spring ephemeral that will be gone if you went out there in another couple of weeks. They're the best resource. If you can take more classes, you can learn more, you can get much deeper. This conversation was sort of intended to be kind of a primer or an introduction.
Yeah.
Well, we've gone into some details. They have classes that can really teach you the details you want to know. And especially we're focused on perennials here because that's what's in your sale. But then you can get into the woodier plants, the shrubs and the trees. But really go to these smaller nurseries, and I've mentioned them again, and they'll be in the follow-up. Many of these people will talk your ear off. And you go to the bigger nurseries, a lot of the sales associates, and it's not their fault, I'm not blaming them, are not educated as much in native plants. But you go to these smaller nurseries and they'll give you all the information you need. They'll tell you all the care you can give them. And I really encourage you to support the smaller nursery.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to make sure we have time for questions, and we've got some questions peppered in here to the Q&A that I'd like to turn to. I also know that you had some visuals you were
Oh yeah,
considering sharing as well, and so I wanted to give you an opportunity to comment on any of those.
I just had some fun photos that I had. I just wanted to spend a second or two talking about some, and I know some of them are in your. Did that cardinal flower come up?
Mm-hmm.
So this is cardinal flower. This is Lobelia cardinalis. It's in a sort of a wetland meadow next to a pond. That's verbena in the background. Some echinacea, stunning plant. And if you want hummingbirds in your garden, you want Lobelia cardinalis because they're the only ones who can access those long tubular flowers. I mentioned Pennsylvania sedge. This is fast becoming one of my favorites in shade. Can you still see that?
Yeah.
Okay. In sun and shade, and it gets this really cool texture. It looks kind of like a swirling river. This is thousands of plants on a slope that have grown together over the years. Provides cover, it provides seeds, and it is a really cool textural element. This is a good substitute for lawns if people want to go. Doesn't take a lot of foot traffic, but you can have that lawn look, but it's radically different.
I have a section of my landscape that the ferns really love, and I'm a little over ferned in my garden. Do you think the Pennsylvania sedge would kind of be a nice
Absolutely,
replacement there? Yeah,
absolutely. It
and
goes
maybe
from
good
goes from shade to sun,
okay,
and that's
yeah.
one of the plants in your sale here. Is this the butterfly with the?
Yes.
So this is butterfly. This is a butterfly on butterfly weed, a little on the nose. But as you see the little sticker on there, I saw this last year for the first time. Monarch Watch is an organization, and they tag butterflies. Actually, you can tag butterflies. You can sign up and get these stickers sent to you, and they tell you exactly how to do it. It's done in the fall, and basically they track the migration of monarchs in the fall from the north. So they track all the way from, people are getting them up in Ontario and up north, and even here. And I saw this on one of my flowers last year in my garden, and I ran in to get, I didn't know what it was. I didn't have my glasses on. I ran in to get my camera, and it's, what a really cool treat to see something like this. But if you want butterflies, butterfly weed is the way to go. So we talked about combinations earlier. Here's a fun combination. This is butterfly weed, sneeze weed, and agastache. So anise hyssop, sneeze weed, and butterfly weed. What a great combination that carries from midsummer well into the fall. So you want long-lasting flowers, this is a great one. And some people might say, well, the orange, yellow, purple isn't really in my color palette, but I think it's a stunning grouping of plants. And the insects that they bring through the heat of the summer is just amazing. I know this isn't one of yours, but I got into photography last year. I got into photographing intimate pictures of plants, and started an Instagram thing because I wanted to really share what's going on in the greater detail, not the step back, but really is going on. And I think this bee is passed out. He wasn't moving. This is Lobelia syphilitica, so this is great blue lobelia, not one of the plants you have, but related very closely and can grow with the cardinal flower that I just showed. But it's just so fun to see all of this activity going on. I think you got drunk on pollen.
Yeah, in those close-up shots, you can really tell the way in which the plant passes on and allows the insects to to spread the pollen to other
Yeah,
plants.
actually, we didn't really talk about that. I know we're getting to the end here, but we didn't really talk about flowers are custom made for specific insects. I mentioned the cardinal flower is meant to have a long tubular flower that is only really pollinated by hummingbirds that come in with their long beaks looking for nectar, and they pollinate it during that process. Lobelias allows bees to get in like that, the blue one. This is a mountain mint, and mountain mints, the plant of the year for 2025 is Pycnanthemum mudicum, which is mountain mint. And this one is narrow leaf. I think what do you have on your list? You have Virginiana, I think it is. Any mountain mint is going to bring more insects than you can imagine. They flower for a very long time. It's a host plant for a lot of plants. You can take the leaves and make a tea out of it. It's just such a great plant. And they flower. They can be bullies. Some more than others, but they're bullies in the way they seed and spread. And use this to your advantage. How many times do I come to properties all the time? They're like, I can't get anything to grow here. We'll find some native bullies and let them battle it out. And mountain mint is one, and it is very reliable, and it is a great plant. And I know it's one of the plants that you have. I think that's it for the selection of. Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, that's good timing because we've got a few audience questions that I want to get to before we wrap up our program. I'll say first, thanks for this terrific overview, and I think our audience has been engaged because we've got some interesting questions here. So I'll lob this first one at you, and it goes back to this notion that you raised earlier that native plants, you want to be careful not to over fertilize. And so this attendee commented that, does this mean that we don't need to fertilize them even with something like Neptune's Harvest, which I think is sort of a compost?
Yeah, correct. If you have the plant in the location, so let's think about butterfly weed. It likes hot and dry. It likes a thin soil, so it's not going to like compost. It's not going to like to be fed. It's going to get floppy if it gets overfed. But if you think about the lobelias, the blue and the red that I was just showing pictures of, these are wetland plants. They're used to being in boggy, organic matter, wet soils. They're going to be nutrient rich. So if you've sited them in the right place, No, native plants don't need fertilizer.
Yeah, and will, if it's something that does enjoy kind of a more organic environment, uh, is it okay to amend a bit with compost, or is it too much of a risk of?
Sure. We might not all have wetlands in our backyard
Yeah, right.
intentionally. And so if you want to recreate that, maybe you create a rain garden, or you find a place where your gutters can drain into, and you
Mm,
can create something like that. And you can add organic matter and compost and leave extra leaves in there. And sure, probably adding some Neptune's Harvest, which is basically a very low nutrient fertilizer, couldn't hurt. But you have to think that, what's happening to that plant in a wetland area. No one's walking around with Neptune's Harvest, fertilizing it. It's you can save a lot of money by not having to go this way.
yeah.
Um, but if you have a plant, maybe the conditions aren't perfect. If you have a wetland plant or something that likes some more organic matter, and the garden isn't that way, it certainly could help until you can change those soil conditions.
Mhm. Another question from the audience is on mulching. This is definitely the time of year when, if you're driving around with your windows down, you can smell mulch everywhere. You can see those volcanoes around trees that people tend to do. And I'm kind of curious myself about, if I want to add mulch to a perennial garden with the intention of suppressing weeds, do I run the risk of also suppressing the plants that I want to grow from coming up and returning? So the basic question is, what are some thoughts on proper mulching techniques?
So anyone who's read my newsletter for more than a year or two gets sick and tired of every spring I get on my soapbox and start yelling about mulching and mulch volcanoes. Mulching is very important for any garden. Weeds take away from, weeds being plants that we have not intentionally planted, take away resources from plants that are there. So mulching is important, and it's different from whether we're mulching woody plants, shrubs and trees, to perennials. Um, any perennial garden, even a native garden, I like to add a mulch, but I don't add a bark mulch or a wood mulch. I love a mulch product called Mad Mix. That's not on the, I did not mention that in my notes, but Mad Mix is basically recycled leaves, and it's fortified with, they basically muck out horse stalls of the wood shavings and the hay, and some of the urine that's in there. Um, and they get rid of all the manure, and they basically use that to compost everything, and they come back with a very rich leaf mulch, but it's heavier than traditional leaf mulches that you can find
Mm,
nowadays. And so I like to mulch perennial gardens with this. It doesn't really add nutrients. It does keep weeds down. It's very light, so if you put it on things in the spring, any native plant will grow through it. A lot of our non-native plants get a little fussy when you put things on top of their root crowns, but I like to do that. You can use a good quality bark mulch. Um, Stay away from the dyed stuff. The stuff that smells, if you smell mulch while you're driving down the street, it's a sour mulch, it's actually going to damage plants. It's probably highly acidic, goes through a phase when organic matter starts to break down, and it might be breaking down due to some chemicals they've added to it. But stay away from any dyed mulch. Those aren't even made from, I mean, it's made from natural wood, but it might be construction debris, or it might be, heartwood cuttings, things like that. Another thing that I like that people have gotten onto, and if you have the space, Chip Drop is a company, an organization that organizes with arborists, and they will dump their truck in your front yard of the chips from the day. And chip drop, or chippings from an arborist, are very different from getting wood chips from a supplier. Wood chips are simply wood chips, and they might be a year old, and it's just the chips. If you get drops from an arborist, it's going to have small branches that are going to have nitrogen in them. It's going to have leaves in it. It's going to have a lot more nutritional value to help that mulch break down. And good, arborist chips can last for 2 seasons. So maybe around your trees, if you have an acre and you have area, you could use wood chips, around your bigger trees, and plants, and then use a mad mix or a leaf mulch or something more delicate, around your perennials. That's sort of how I go. But make sure, especially if you're using a contractor to bring in mulch, ask exactly what it is and where it's coming from. Because there's some nasty stuff out there that can cause more damage. And I'm not even getting into how you mulch. Perennial gardens need an inch or two of mulch around trees or shrubs. You can do up to 3 or 4, but you cannot put them up against the stems or the root balls of the plants. You see contractors throwing mulch into shrubs. You can't do that. It's to provide cover around. It insulates, keeps the temperatures consistent, keeps the weeds down, keeps the moisture in. Those are really the benefits of it.
And to those in our audience that are Lexington residents, in case you are not aware, our compost facility on Hartwell Ave has free mulch available that you can go and pick up.
It's probably, is it a leaf mulch? Probably is a leaf mulch.
No, it's a wood mulch.
Oh, it is. Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
More questions coming in. This one I'm sure you've answered a million times before, and I know from reading your newsletter. Any ideas about minimizing rabbits? And are rabbits particularly interested in natives?
Of course they are. I mean, they're interested in all plants. Native plants are susceptible to rabbit munching. Now, most of the I've written about this for years, and I'm not going to get into the theories, but rabbits eat a large number of plants, many native. Now, most of the rabbits in our yards are not the native rabbits, the eastern cottontail. While we have some, most of them are from the Midwest that were brought in, a century ago. And we have had an enormous population explosion of rabbits. And so as someone who's in the does design work and works in gardens, what happens one year to the next is different. I went to another property just the other day to find lavender mowed down again, and that's the third property I've seen lavender mowed down by rabbits. Lavender was supposed to be rock solid. Why are they, they don't like fragrance, they don't like this type of stuff. But one side of town to the other can be different. Depends upon the pressure, depends upon if you're on the side of Lexington close to open space that might have more coyote and foxes that are keeping the rabbit population in check. Where I live, no one's keeping them in check. And I drive through at night and I feel like there are 100 eyes looking at me. And they are every season, they're going after different things. But to quote an old movie, you got to know your enemy. And so spend some time and understand how they feed. The spring, the moms are now digging holes. You're going to see holes throughout your garden where they're testing out spaces where they're going to put nests. If rabbits are happy, if they're happy in your garden, they'll have 5 or 6 litters of rabbits with 3 or 4 each time during a year. And without predators, that's where the explosion comes from. Also knowing when litters come and when you see small rabbits don't have the knowledge of older rabbits. They'll eat and test anything. Yeah. So what I've been doing with people who are putting in new gardens, unless you're putting in bigger trees, if you're putting in perennials and smaller stuff, I am spraying it with liquid fence. Even if it's something I know is rock solid. Basically, I'm teaching rabbits and I'm telling every client who puts stuff in to spray with liquid fence. It's just one of these products that smells god awful and deters them. And it basically is trying to teach them and train them to not eat this plant. Because if you put in a 6-inch perennial and a baby rabbit comes and browses it, it's done for the season. So there's so many different things, but you need to really understand. You also need to understand that come the late winter when rabbits are desperate and there's snow cover, they're going to start looking for moisture and water. So they're going to start gnawing on stems of plants. So you need to know when they do certain things to know when to protect certain things.
Right.
They're going to mow down azaleas in the late winter. You don't need to cage them. And this is it's not new, but it's gotten out of control. You don't need to cage them and work on them in December. You need to be ready in February and March. So you need to learn your garden, know when they attack things, and then try to anticipate when they're going to do things. Again, this would be a whole other conversation if we want to talk about rabbits.
Yeah. Another question that's come in that I'll rephrase it slightly. If you had to choose, if your aim was to maximize ecological value, and you had to choose where to start between trees, shrubs, perennials, or grasses, which would you say is kind of the best place to start if your aim is maximizing ecological value?
Well, it depends. If you have the space, trees and shrubs are going to provide far more and provide for a far more diverse population of insects than anything else. But most of us can't go out and buy and put in 8 trees and 40 shrubs and then come in and throw in 50 perennials. So it really depends. I encourage you to go to Doug Tallamy. Again, it's going to be in the email that comes to you. He created an organization called Homegrown National Park. And the idea is to support people who wonder, I mean, when we recycle, we say, or when we vote, we wonder, does our vote count? Does it really matter that I throw these plastic bottles away? What he's done in the aggregate, people sign up for Homegrown National Park. They put in their X square feet and how many plants they planted. And in the aggregate, he shows how much native habitat has been restored. And it's kind of a neat thing, and they provide all sorts of information. And then on the site, there's a whole section on Doug Tallamy. I really encourage you, if you want to go deeper, he's the best resource. He speaks in a very accessible way. He is very supportive. He's not one of these people who says, dig it all up. He says, start, small baby steps and go from there.
I think that answer and Doug Tallamy's work and kind of trying to pull the homegrown garden movement together jives well with a question or a comment that we got in the Q&A, which is that gardens represent such a small fraction of the overall natural environment. So is it is it just a drop in the bucket? Is the juice worth the squeeze on just a small fraction of the overall landscape?
Yes. If you can provide in your garden, if you have 500 square feet and you put in 30 perennials and you follow some of the practices we've talking about, you're going to provide a home for larvae and bees and insects in your soil over the winter. You're going to provide a place for them to come in the summer, and maybe they're going to borrow off your neighbor's tree. Maybe they're going to go into downtown Lexington where you have other trees, or where the garden clubs are supporting islands with native plants, or down to the wetland, on the ponds and the streams. In the aggregate, they'll find things, but you can create your own community. And as I said, you can't do it all. Rob Jagier down at UMass Dartmouth, who I mentioned earlier, and there's also a link I'll provide. He talks about on a quarter acre of land, you can more than service the ecosystem. But if you want the bang for your buck, it's the bigger plants that have the broader coverage. But if you go and buy a couple of these kits that they have of perennials here and site them properly, and then go to one of these nurseries and buy another dozen plants, you're doing your part. If that's all the space you have, and then go talk to your neighbor, show how beautiful your garden looks, and show it to your neighbor, and have them do the same, or maybe force them to buy the tree because they have an extra 2,000 square feet, or they just had one taken down. So in the aggregate is the idea. Bit by bit, we're trying to bring the ecosystem back by providing these spaces.
I think that's a perfect place to wrap the conversation, and a great mentality for folks to leave with. We've come to the end of our time here, so Reed, I'd just like to thank you so much for your time here today. I thought it was a really interesting conversation, and like I said at the top, I've always wanted to pick your brain on some of these topics, and so it's been a pleasure to get to know you and to have you on our program. So thanks very much for attending.
Well, thanks for having me, and just in a final word, just take a step forward. We all have spent thousands of dollars over the year, however much, on our non-native or traditional gardens. We've never been afraid to go and buy $500 worth of annuals, or go buy all these perennials and put them in and then watch them lose half them. Do the same thing with native plants. Go explore them, find them. The plants that they have at this sale is by no means a comprehensive list. It's just a start. Go to some of the resources I provide. Go to one of the small nurseries and tell them you have a 100 square foot area in the sun with lousy soil, and they'll tell you what to put in there. And go experiment, go try, and you're going to find that they're beautiful. You're going to find that they're less maintenance, less care. You're not going to buy fertilizer. You're not going to buy herbicides, insecticides, and you're doing the right thing too.
That's great. Thanks again, Reed. And I think to wrap up, I'm going to turn it back over to Helen with the Cary Library.
Great. Well, thank you for a wonderful conversation, Reed and Andy. And thank you, Charlie and Lexington Living Landscapes. For those of you who want to watch the program again, the recap will be sent with a link to the recording as well as the resources that were mentioned this evening. So thank you all for joining us, and thank you both again.
Thank you.
Thanks.